Hello, everyone. Before you go, don't forget to subscribe and click the like button and tell us in the comments which city are you listening from. So let's get started. It was Thursday evening, and I was unpacking the last of my boxes in my new Denver apartment, trying to build something that felt like home again. I'd moved here 3 weeks ago after everything fell apart back in Chicago. The miscarriage, David leaving, the suffocating sympathy from everyone who knew. This one-bedroom unit on the 4th floor of Maple Heights was supposed to be my sanctuary, a place where nobody knew my story and I could finally breathe again. The building was quiet, mostly young professionals who kept to themselves, which was exactly what I needed. My apartment had become my refuge in ways I'd never experienced before. The living room faced east with large windows that caught the morning sun, while my bedroom stayed cool and dark in the back. I knew every creak of the hardwood floors, every shadow the streetlights cast through my blinds, every reflection of headlights across my ceiling when cars passed below. It was my space, my territory, where I could exist without performance or explanation. After months of feeling exposed and raw, having these walls around me felt like the first real protection I'd had. During those early weeks, my days followed a strict, comforting routine. Wake at 7, coffee while watching the sunrise, work from my laptop at the kitchen table, grocery shopping at the Whole Foods down the street, dinner while streaming something mindless, and lights out by 10. It was a simple life, deliberately empty of complications or surprises. I'd grown to love the predictability after so much chaos. The routine felt like rebuilding myself, one small, manageable piece at a time. Never did I imagine that this careful structure I'd created could become the very thing that made me vulnerable. I remember feeling particularly settled that Thursday evening, surrounded by the familiar scents of vanilla candles and the lavender fabric softener I used on my new curtains. The building's central heating created a gentle white noise that felt like being wrapped in cotton, and I could hear the distant murmur of traffic that reminded me I was part of a living city without being overwhelmed by it. Everything about that evening felt like progress, like I was finally learning to be okay alone. The silence that once felt oppressive now felt protective. If I'd known that this would be my last evening of genuine peace in that apartment, I would have savored it more completely. I would have paid attention to how safe I felt in my own skin, how the walls around me felt solid and trustworthy, how the lock on my door seemed like enough protection from the world. I would have noticed how my shoulders weren't tense, how my breathing came easily, how I could focus on simple tasks without constantly looking over my shoulder. These were luxuries I was about to lose without even realizing I'd had them. I was making dinner, just pasta with store-bought sauce, nothing complicated, when I first noticed something was off. I'd been enjoying the meditative quality of cooking, the way chopping vegetables and stirring sauce required just enough attention to quiet my anxious thoughts. The kitchen window was cracked open to let in the cool October air, and I could smell someone grilling nearby, hear children playing in the courtyard below. It was such an ordinary moment that I almost missed the first sign entirely. Just a small thing, barely worth noticing. I'd always felt secure in this building, with its keycard entry system and security cameras in the lobby. My apartment was on the 4th floor, accessible only by elevator or 4 flights of stairs, and I'd met most of my immediate neighbors during my first week. Mrs. Rodriguez in 4B brought me cookies, the college students in 4A were polite but kept their music down, and the unit across from me had been empty since I moved in. The building felt safe, inhabited by people who respected boundaries and minded their own business. I'd specifically chosen this place because it felt like somewhere I could heal without interference. It was during this completely ordinary evening routine that I noticed the first thing that didn't quite fit. So small and explicable that I almost dismissed it immediately, but something made me pause with my hand on the wooden spoon, staring at my reflection in the dark window above the sink. The first sign was subtle. My welcome mat was askew when I came home from work, pushed slightly to the left in a way that seemed deliberate rather than accidental. I stood in the hallway for a moment, key in hand, trying to remember if I'd been careless when I left that morning. But I was compulsive about these small details now, hyper-aware of my environment in ways I'd never been before the trauma. I straightened the mat and unlocked my door, telling myself it was probably just the maintenance crew or someone's grocery bag catching the corner. Nothing worth worrying about, certainly nothing that should make my pulse quicken the way it did.
My immediate reaction was to rationalize. It must have been the cleaning lady who came through on Thursdays, or maybe someone had stumbled slightly while walking past. I continued unpacking my dinner: fresh pasta, a jar of marinara, some grated Parmesan, without giving it much more thought. The logical part of my brain was still functioning normally then, still capable of providing reasonable explanations for minor anomalies. I wasn't yet living in the hyper-vigilant state that would soon become my constant reality. I was still a person who could let small things go. 20 minutes later, when I went to check my mail, I noticed that my package delivery notification had been opened. The small Amazon box I'd been expecting, just some basic kitchen supplies, was sitting in the lobby's package room, but the tape had been carefully slit and resealed. Inside, my new coffee filters were still there, but they'd been removed from their original packaging and placed in a neat stack. It was such a strange thing to do. Why would someone open a package just to repack it? I stood there holding the box, feeling confused rather than alarmed. It made no sense. Over the next few hours, small discrepancies accumulated like drops of water I was only beginning to notice. My newspaper, which I always left folded on my kitchen counter, was spread open to the local news section when I was certain I'd left it untouched. The chain lock on my door, which I obsessively checked every night, was hanging loose when I went to secure it before bed. My laptop had been moved exactly 3 inches to the right on my desk. I knew because it no longer aligned with the wood grain pattern I'd been unconsciously using as a guide. Individually, each incident could be explained away. Together, they created a pattern that made my skin feel tight with unease. Eventually, I walked through my apartment more carefully, looking for anything else that seemed off. I checked my bedroom, bathroom, kitchen, living room. Everything appeared normal at first glance. My windows were still locked, my door showed no signs of tampering, my valuables were all in their proper places. The apartment felt exactly as I'd left it, with that particular stillness that comes from being truly unoccupied. I settled back on my couch with a cup of tea, convincing myself that stress and the lingering effects of trauma were making me paranoid. My therapist had warned me this might happen. Hypervigilance was a common response to what I'd been through. But even after I'd explained everything away, a nagging sensation remained lodged in my chest like a splinter. It was that primitive feeling of being watched, the kind that makes the hair on your arms stand up for no logical reason. I found myself glancing toward my windows more frequently, even though they faced only the building's courtyard and another residential complex. I kept feeling like I was missing something important, like there was a presence just outside my peripheral vision. The feeling was persistent enough that I turned off my music and sat in complete silence for several minutes, listening for any sound that didn't belong. To distract myself from the growing anxiety, I decided to do some online shopping, something mindless and therapeutic that would require just enough focus to quiet my racing thoughts. I browsed through clothing sites and added items to various carts without purchasing anything, letting the familiar ritual of consumer browsing soothe my nerves. For about an hour, it worked. The combination of visual stimulation and the illusion of control that comes with making choices, even meaningless ones, helped me feel more like myself again. I almost forgot about the displaced mat and the opened package. But as the evening progressed, The small incidents became harder to ignore. I found my coffee mug in the dishwasher, even though I distinctly remembered leaving it in the sink. My throw blanket was folded differently than I ever folded it, in neat thirds instead of my usual careless bundle. Most disturbingly, my phone showed that I'd sent a text message to my sister at 3:47 p.m. saying, "Thinking of you," even though I'd been in back-to-back video calls all afternoon and hadn't touched my personal phone for hours. When I asked her about it, she said it had seemed sweet, but out of character for me. I stared at the message thread, feeling cold all over. The first undeniable confirmation came on Friday evening when I was getting ready for bed. As I closed my bedroom curtains, I saw him clearly, a man standing perfectly still in the courtyard below, looking directly up at my window. He wasn't trying to hide. If anything, he seemed to want me to see him. He was average height with dark hair, wearing a gray hoodie that made him blend into the evening shadows. But his stillness was unnatural, predatory. He stood there for at least 30 seconds, long enough for me to register every detail of his posture, before he turned and walked calmly toward the building's side entrance. I recognized him then. He was the new tenant who'd moved into 5C just 2 days after I'd arrived.
The shock of seeing him there, clearly watching my apartment, sent adrenaline flooding through my system. My hands started shaking as I yanked the curtains closed, and I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. For several minutes, I stood frozen in my bedroom, processing what I'd just witnessed. There was no innocent explanation for his behavior, no reason for him to be standing in the courtyard at 9:30 p.m., staring up at a specific window with that kind of focused intensity. I felt violated in a way that reminded me of the worst moments after my miscarriage, when my body had felt like it belonged to everyone except me. This man had turned my sanctuary into a fishbowl. I forced myself to check every window in my apartment, staying away from direct sightlines but positioning myself to see if he was still out there. The courtyard was empty now, but I could see lights on in apartment 5C, the unit directly above mine. I wondered how long he'd been watching me, how many of my routines he'd observed from that vantage point. The thought of him up there, possibly looking down at me right now, made my skin crawl. I realized that what I'd interpreted as clumsiness or coincidence over the past few days had actually been surveillance. He'd been learning my patterns, testing my awareness. Immediately, I went through my apartment and closed every curtain, turned on every light, and double-checked every lock. But even as I took these precautions, I understood how futile they were. He lived in the same building. He had legitimate reasons to be in the lobby, the elevators, the stairwells. My apartment, which had felt like a fortress just hours ago, now seemed transparent and accessible. I could feel the weight of his attention pressing down from the floor above, and I knew that my peaceful anonymity in Denver was over. Whatever this man wanted from me, he wasn't going to lose interest and move on. I spent the next hour researching everything I could about building security and tenant rights, trying to understand what options I had. The management company's emergency line just went to voicemail, and I realized that until Monday, I was essentially on my own. I considered calling the police, but what would I report? That my neighbor had looked at my window from a public courtyard? That some of my belongings had been moved around in ways that might be paranoia? I had no proof of any actual crime, just a growing certainty that something was terribly wrong. The gap between my fear and what I could legally prove felt impossible to bridge. The real escalation began the following Monday when I discovered he'd somehow been inside my apartment.
I came home from a grocery run to find evidence that was impossible to dismiss. My bed had been carefully made, with hospital corners, even though I always left it unmade. My bathroom towels were hanging with perfect symmetry, something I never bothered with. Most chilling, there was a single coffee cup in my sink, clean, but still warm to the touch. I stood in my kitchen holding that cup, my hands trembling as I realized what it meant. He hadn't just been watching me, he'd been living parallel moments in my space, using my things, experiencing my home in an intimate way that felt like rape. When I checked my door, there were no signs of forced entry. No scratched locks or damaged frames. My windows were still secure. My key card was still in my purse, and my spare key was still hidden exactly where I'd left it under the fake rock on my balcony. The violation was surgical in its precision. He'd found a way in that left no trace, which suggested planning and skill that went beyond casual obsession. I felt like I was discovering that I'd been living in a dollhouse, my privacy just an illusion created by someone who held all the real power. Every surface he might have touched now felt contaminated. For the next several hours, I searched my apartment for anything else that might have been disturbed, and the discoveries made my stomach turn. My underwear drawer showed signs of careful rearrangement. Nothing missing, but the order was wrong in ways only I would notice. My laptop's browser history included searches I didn't make, mostly about pregnancy loss and grief counseling, as if he'd been researching my psychological state. Most disturbing, there were new photos in my phone's camera roll, pictures of me sleeping, cooking, sitting on my couch, all taken from angles that suggested he'd been in my apartment multiple times. The metadata showed they'd been taken over the past week during times I'd thought I was completely alone. I tried calling the police then, but the responding officer seemed skeptical about everything except the photos on my phone. Even those, he suggested, could have been taken by someone with access to my iCloud account rather than physical presence in my apartment. He filed a report and said they'd increase patrols in the area, but made it clear that without evidence of breaking and entering, their options were limited. He recommended changing my locks and maybe staying with friends for a few days. As he was leaving, he paused and said something that chilled me. "You know, ma'am, sometimes when people are dealing with trauma, they can misinterpret normal interactions. Are you sure you're not just feeling vulnerable because of what you've been through?" His dismissal felt like a second violation. The persistence of the invasion became clear over the next few days. Despite changing my locks and installing a security camera in my living room, the incidents continued with disturbing regularity. My groceries would be rearranged in my refrigerator while I was at work. My mail would arrive already opened and carefully resealed. Worst of all, text messages continued to be sent from my phone, sometimes to my therapist canceling appointments, sometimes to my sister with updates about my life that were accurate but written in a voice that wasn't quite mine. It was as if he was slowly assuming control of my communication with the outside world, isolating me in ways that were too subtle for others to fully understand. The breaking point came when my security camera captured something that should have been impossible. I was at work when I got a motion alert on my phone, and I watched in real time as the man from 5C moved casually through my living room, examining my things with the familiarity of someone who belonged there. He wasn't wearing gloves or a mask. He seemed completely comfortable, even making himself a sandwich in my kitchen before settling on my couch to watch my TV. The timestamp showed he'd been there for over 2 hours, and there was no footage of him entering or leaving. It was as if he'd simply materialized inside my locked apartment. When I called building security, they insisted that my door had never been opened according to their logs. That night, I waited in the lobby with the footage ready to show the police when they arrived. But when they ran my building keycard through their system, it showed that I had entered my apartment at the exact time the footage was recorded, as if I'd been there myself, watching myself move through my own space. The technical impossibility of the situation seemed to convince the officers that I was having some kind of psychological break rather than being stalked. They were gentle but firm in their suggestion that I seek mental health treatment. As they left, I saw the man from 5C standing in the lobby, watching our interaction with an expression of mild curiosity. When our eyes met, he smiled and nodded politely, as if we were friendly neighbors. 2 weeks later, the official investigation concluded that there was no evidence of criminal activity. The detective assigned to my case explained that all the electronic evidence pointed to normal building access and normal phone activity. The photos on my phone had been taken with my own device, the text messages had been sent with my authorization codes, and the security footage showed only me entering and leaving my apartment. According to their digital forensics expert, everything suggested either a very sophisticated frame job or psychological disturbance on my part. They recommended I speak with a psychiatrist and consider that trauma might be affecting my perception of reality. The case was closed, pending new evidence. The explanation they offered was that I was experiencing a delayed stress response to my miscarriage and breakup, manifested as paranoid delusions and possible dissociative episodes. The building management suggested that perhaps I should consider relocating if I wasn't comfortable in the unit, but they saw no reason to investigate the tenant in 5C, who had no history of complaints and was described by other residents as quiet and polite. It was a tidy resolution that left everyone satisfied except me. I was the problem that needed to be managed, not the victim of something that needed to be solved. For a brief period after the police involvement, I tried to convince myself that they might be right. Maybe the stress had been more damaging than I realized. Maybe I was losing time, doing things I couldn't remember, creating elaborate scenarios to explain my own dissociation. I increased my therapy sessions and started taking the anti-anxiety medication my doctor prescribed. For about a week, I almost felt normal again, as if accepting the official explanation had lifted a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. I thought perhaps I could rebuild my sense of safety through medical treatment and time. But the incidents never really stopped. They just became more careful, more subtle, as if my observer had learned from the police investigation. I still found evidence of his presence: a warm coffee cup, a rearranged bookshelf, towels hung with impossible precision, but now I questioned each discovery. Was I remembering wrong? Had I moved that item myself and forgotten? The line between reality and paranoia had become so blurred that I could no longer trust my own perceptions. This uncertainty became more torturous than the original fear, because now I was afraid of my own mind as much as I was afraid of him.
The residual signs continued in ways that kept me perpetually off balance. I would come home to find my apartment exactly as I'd left it, but with the lingering scent of cologne I didn't wear. My neighbor's routine upstairs would shift to match mine. When I started working out in the evenings, he started running on a treadmill directly above my living room at the same time. When I changed my sleep schedule, the footsteps above me changed too. These parallels could have been coincidence, but they felt like a conversation, as if my life was being mirrored by someone who was studying me with scientific precision. I installed additional security measures, a doorbell camera, window alarms, motion sensors, but they only documented my own increasing paranoia. The footage showed me checking and rechecking locks, peering through curtains, jumping at normal building sounds. I looked like exactly what everyone thought I was, a woman having a psychological breakdown. Meanwhile, my neighbor appeared in the background of occasional shots, as a normal resident going about his daily life. He jogged past my door, collected his mail, chatted pleasantly with other tenants. To any outside observer, I was the problem in this scenario. Today, 6 months later, I still perform my nightly security ritual of checking every lock, every window, every shadow. I've learned to live with the constant sensation of being observed, even though I can never prove it's real. My therapist says I'm making progress, learning to manage my trauma responses and rebuild my sense of safety. But late at night, when I hear footsteps in the apartment above mine moving in perfect synchronization with my own movements around my space, I know that some threats are too sophisticated to be captured by cameras or convinced away by therapy. The man in 5C is still there, still watching, still waiting for something I don't understand. And the most terrifying part isn't what he's done. It's realizing that everything so far might have just been preparation for whatever he's actually planning.
It was Tuesday evening, and I was unpacking the last of my boxes in what would become my new home. I had moved into the small rental house at 696 Maple Street just 3 days earlier, drawn by the affordable rent and quiet neighborhood. The house was modest but charming, with large windows that let in plenty of natural light and hardwood floors that creaked pleasantly underfoot. After months of searching, I finally had a place to call my own, a sanctuary where I could rebuild my life after the messy divorce. My new home felt like the fresh start I desperately needed. The living room opened directly into a cozy kitchen, and a narrow hallway led to 2 bedrooms and a bathroom at the back of the house. Large windows faced the street in front and opened to a small backyard behind, giving me clear sight lines in both directions. Every corner felt warm and welcoming, from the built-in bookshelves to the vintage light fixtures that the previous tenant had left behind. I knew every squeak in the floorboards, every shadow cast by the afternoon sun, every way the light played across the walls throughout the day. In those first 3 days, my routine was blissfully simple and predictable. I would wake up around 7, make coffee in my new kitchen while watching the morning joggers pass by my front window, then spend the day organizing my belongings and making the space truly mine. Evenings were for takeout dinners eaten while streaming shows on my laptop, followed by long baths in the surprisingly spacious bathroom. It was a quiet, solitary existence, but after the chaos of the past year, the predictability felt like a luxury. I cherished every mundane moment of domestic tranquility. The neighborhood had an old-world charm that immediately put me at ease. Tree-lined streets stretched in both directions, with well-maintained houses set back behind small front yards and white picket fences. The sounds were exactly what you'd expect from suburban life. Children playing in distant yards, lawn mowers on weekend mornings, the occasional dog barking, and the gentle hum of air conditioners during the warmer afternoons. Even the evening brought only the peaceful sounds of settling houses and distant traffic. Everything about the environment suggested safety, normalcy, and the kind of community where neighbors looked out for each other. If I had known that those first 3 days would be my only period of true peace in that house, I would have savored them more completely. I would have taken photographs of how the morning light fell across my coffee cup, memorized the exact way the evening shadows stretched across my living room floor, and appreciated
the simple joy of falling asleep without fear or anxiety. Those innocent moments of domestic bliss would soon become precious memories, haunted by the knowledge of what was to come. But in my naivety, I assumed this tranquility was my new permanent reality. I was in the middle of hanging pictures on the living room wall when I first met Mrs. Chen, my elderly neighbor from next door. She appeared at my front door around noon on Thursday, carrying a plate of homemade cookies and wearing a concerned expression that seemed at odds with her friendly gesture. She was a tiny woman, probably in her 70s, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her voice carried a slight accent, and there was something in her demeanor that suggested she had important information to share, though she seemed hesitant to burden a newcomer with whatever was on her mind. I had always been the type of person who felt secure in my own space, confident in my ability to maintain a safe and comfortable home environment. The house had good locks on both the front and back doors, decent lighting around the perimeter, and I had already introduced myself to several neighbors who seemed friendly and reliable. The windows were equipped with secure latches, and the neighborhood watch program was active according to the welcome packet I'd received from the local community association. After living in a cramped apartment for 2 years, where I could hear every footstep from upstairs neighbors, the peace and privacy of my own house felt like the ultimate luxury. Nothing in my previous experience had prepared me for the idea that a home could become anything other than a safe haven. It was during this perfectly ordinary afternoon, as I positioned a framed photograph on the mantelpiece, that Mrs. Chen's conversation took an unexpected turn that would haunt me for weeks to come. She had been making small talk about the neighborhood, complimenting my choice of paint colors and asking about my work, when she suddenly grew quiet and glanced toward the street. Her expression shifted from neighborly warmth to something more guarded, almost fearful, and she lowered her voice as if someone might be listening. What she said next shattered my comfortable assumptions about my new home and planted the first seed of fear that would eventually consume my sense of security completely.
The first sign that something was unusual came when Mrs. Chen hesitated mid-sentence, her eyes darting toward my front windows before she leaned closer and whispered, "I should probably mention something about this house." Her tone had changed completely from the cheerful, neighborly chatter we'd been sharing just moments before, becoming urgent and concerned in a way that made my stomach tighten with unexpected anxiety. She glanced around nervously, as if checking to make sure we were alone, before continuing in that same hushed voice that immediately commanded my full attention. The plate of cookies suddenly felt heavy in my hands as I waited for her to continue. My immediate reaction was to assume she was being overly dramatic about some minor neighborhood gossip, or perhaps a previous tenant who had been difficult or messy. I smiled politely and offered her a cup of coffee, expecting her to share some harmless story about loud parties or an unkempt yard that had irritated the neighbors. After all, every neighborhood has its stories, and new residents are always warned about the local characters or minor inconveniences they should expect. I was prepared to nod sympathetically and assure her that I would be a considerate neighbor who wouldn't cause any problems. But the look in her eyes suggested something far more serious than typical neighborhood complaints. As she accepted my offer of coffee and we settled into my living room, Mrs. Chen's story began to unfold in a way that made my casual curiosity transform into genuine unease. She explained that the previous tenant, a young woman named Sarah, had lived in the house for only 6 months before disappearing without notice in the middle of the night. According to Mrs. Chen, Sarah had been friendly and normal when she first moved in, but in her final weeks, she had become increasingly paranoid and frightened, often calling Mrs. Chen to report strange occurrences around the property.
The landlord had found the house empty one morning, with Sarah's belongings still inside, but no forwarding address or explanation for her sudden departure. Even more disturbing, this wasn't the first time such a thing had happened at 696 Maple Street. Over the next 20 minutes, Mrs. Chen revealed a pattern that sent chills down my spine and made me question my decision to rent this particular house. She described how, over the past 5 years, 3 different tenants had lived in my house, and all had left under mysterious circumstances after reporting similar disturbing experiences. Each had started with minor complaints about feeling watched, finding their belongings slightly moved, and receiving unwanted attention from someone they couldn't identify. The stories escalated in remarkably similar ways: strange gifts left on doorsteps, figures lurking near the property at odd hours, and an increasing sense that they were being stalked by someone with intimate knowledge of their daily routines. All 3 had eventually fled in the middle of the night, leaving behind their deposits and personal belongings in their desperate haste to escape. What made Mrs. Chen's revelations even more disturbing was her matter-of-fact delivery, as if she had resigned herself to watching this cycle repeat indefinitely. She explained that she had tried to warn previous tenants, but most had initially dismissed her concerns as the paranoid ramblings of an elderly woman who watched too many crime shows. It was only after they began experiencing the phenomena themselves that they understood the truth of her warnings, and it was often too late to take proper precautions. She had watched from her window as each tenant's behavior changed from confident and relaxed to fearful and hypervigilant, and she had seen the same progression of events unfold with disturbing regularity. The house seemed to attract these situations, or perhaps even create them in ways that defied logical explanation. Mrs. Chen's final warning was delivered with a gravity that left no room for doubt about her sincerity. The house at 696 has taken someone before, and I'm afraid it will again. She explained that she had lived next door for over 20 years and had never seen anything like the pattern that had emerged in recent years. Something about the property seemed to invite or attract dangerous attention, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the house itself was somehow complicit in the cycle of fear and disappearance that had claimed its recent occupants. She urged me to be especially careful about my daily routines, to vary my schedule whenever possible, and to call her immediately if she noticed anything unusual or threatening. As she prepared to leave, she pressed a small piece of paper with her phone number into my hand and made me promise to take her warning seriously.
For the rest of that afternoon, I found myself unable to concentrate on my unpacking, instead replaying Mrs. Chen's words and trying to make sense of what she had told me. I walked through each room of my house with new eyes, wondering what the previous tenants had experienced within these same walls, and whether I was destined to follow the same terrifying pattern. The large windows that had seemed welcoming now felt exposed and vulnerable, offering too many sightlines for potential observers. Every creak in the floorboards, every shadow shifting with the changing light, every small sound from outside took on new significance. I tried to convince myself that Mrs. Chen was simply an old woman with an overactive imagination, but something deep in my gut told me to take her warning seriously and prepare for whatever might come. The first truly unsettling incident occurred 3 days after my conversation with Mrs. Chen, on a quiet Sunday evening when I was cooking dinner and enjoying the peaceful routine of my new domestic life. I had been dicing vegetables for a stir-fry when I caught a glimpse of movement outside my kitchen window from the corner of my eye. Just a brief shadow passing by the glass that made me pause with the knife halfway through a carrot. The movement had seemed deliberate and human-sized, but when I looked up directly, there was nothing visible in my small backyard except the usual evening shadows cast by the neighbor's trees. I stood there for several seconds, studying the yard carefully, but saw only the normal suburban landscape of grass, fence, and the few small shrubs that bordered the property.
My first instinct was to rationalize what I had seen in the most logical way possible. Probably just a neighbor's cat moving through the yard, or perhaps a delivery person who had taken a wrong turn and was cutting through to reach the correct address. I had lived in enough places to know that peripheral vision can play tricks, especially when you're focused on a task like cooking and not paying full attention to your surroundings. I returned to my vegetables, though I found myself glancing toward the window more frequently than usual, and I made a mental note to perhaps install some outdoor lighting in the backyard to eliminate the areas of deep shadow that could conceal movement. It was a perfectly reasonable response to a perfectly explainable situation. 20 minutes later, as I was plating my dinner, the movement happened again, this time more clearly and for a longer duration that left no room for misinterpretation. A dark figure moved deliberately from left to right across my field of vision, clearly visible through the window and definitely human in size and movement pattern. This time, I immediately dropped my plate and rushed to the window, pressing my face against the glass to get a better view of the yard. But again, there was nothing there. No person, no cat, no explanation for what I had clearly seen just seconds before. The evening was still and quiet, with no sounds of footsteps or movement, no rustling of leaves or closing of gates that might indicate someone had been there and departed quickly. Over the following week, these brief sightings became more frequent and began to establish a pattern that I could no longer dismiss as coincidence or imagination. The figure appeared most often during the evening hours when I was cooking or relaxing in the living room, always moving across my field of vision in the same direction, always disappearing completely by the time I could focus on the area where I had seen it. Sometimes the movement was at the edge of my backyard, sometimes near the front windows, and occasionally I caught glimpses of the figure standing completely still near my property line before melting back into the shadows. Each incident was brief and could technically be explained away, but together they formed a pattern of deliberate observation that made my skin crawl with the realization that someone was watching my house regularly. I began to keep a small notebook where I recorded each sighting, the time, location, duration, and any other details I could remember. Within 2 weeks, I had documented nearly 20 separate incidents, and the pattern was undeniable. Someone was conducting surveillance of my property and timing their observations to coincide with my most routine and predictable activities. The figure seemed to know when I would be in the kitchen preparing meals, when I typically settled down to watch television in the evening, and even when I usually went to bed based on the pattern of lights going on and off throughout my house. This level of detailed knowledge about my habits suggested that the observation had been going on longer than I had initially realized, possibly from the very day I moved in.
I spent hours standing at my windows, trying to catch a clearer glimpse of whoever was watching me, but the figures seemed to have an almost supernatural ability to avoid direct observation while maintaining their surveillance activities. I installed motion sensor lights in both the front and back of the house, hoping to illuminate any nighttime visitors, but the lights never seemed to trigger when the figure was present, almost as if they knew exactly where the sensors were positioned and how to avoid them. The feeling of being constantly watched became a persistent source of anxiety that made even the simplest activities feel exposed and vulnerable. Every time I moved through my house, I wondered if I was being observed, and every shadow outside my windows seemed to potentially conceal the mysterious figure who had made my home their focus. The first piece of physical evidence appeared on a Thursday morning when I discovered a single red rose placed carefully on my front doorstep, with no note or explanation for its presence there. The flower was fresh and expensive looking, clearly purchased from a florist rather than picked from someone's garden, and it had been positioned precisely in the center of my doormat, where I couldn't possibly miss it when leaving for work.
I looked up and down the street, hoping to spot a delivery truck or catch sight of whoever had left it, but the neighborhood was quiet, with only the usual early morning joggers and dog walkers going about their routines. None of my neighbors were outside, and there were no unfamiliar vehicles parked nearby that might explain the unexpected gift. When I questioned my neighbors about whether they had seen anyone approaching my house early that morning, none of them reported anything unusual, though Mrs. Chen gave me a knowing look that confirmed her suspicions about what was happening. She asked to see the rose and examined it carefully before shaking her head with an expression that mixed concern with resignation. "Sarah got flowers too," she told me quietly, referring to the previous tenant who had disappeared. "Started with roses, then other things, always placed where she would find them, never when anyone was watching." Her words sent a chill through me as I realized that whoever was watching me was now escalating their behavior from passive observation to active contact, following the same pattern that Mrs. Chen had described with the previous tenants. Over the next 2 weeks, the gifts continued to appear with disturbing regularity, each one more personal and unsettling than the last. A box of expensive chocolates appeared on my car windshield while I was at work, though the office building had security cameras that should have captured anyone approaching the parking lot. A bottle of wine that matched the brand I had purchased just days before was left on my back porch, suggesting that whoever was leaving these items was monitoring even my shopping habits. Most disturbing of all was the framed photograph of my house that appeared on my doorstep one morning, clearly taken from across the street and showing me visible in one of the front windows, proving that the surveillance was not only ongoing, but being documented in ways that felt increasingly threatening. Each gift was accompanied by the same meticulous placement and timing that avoided any possibility of observation by neighbors or security cameras. I began varying my schedule, leaving and returning at different times, hoping to catch whoever was responsible in the act of leaving their unwanted presence. I even took several sick days and spent entire mornings watching from my windows, but the gifts continued to appear, as if by magic, during the brief moments when I stepped away from my vigil. The person responsible seemed to have an intimate knowledge not only of my routines, but also of my efforts to break those routines, adapting their approach to maintain their ability to make contact while remaining completely invisible and unidentifiable. The psychological impact of these unwanted gifts was profound and deliberate, designed to communicate several disturbing messages simultaneously. First, they demonstrated that I was being watched constantly and that my observer had detailed knowledge of my preferences, schedule, and daily activities. Second, they showed that this person could access my personal space at will, approaching my house and car without being detected despite my growing vigilance and security measures. Most unsettling of all, they suggested a level of obsession and planning that went far beyond casual criminal opportunism, indicating that I had somehow become the specific focus of someone's dangerous fixation.
It was on a rainy Tuesday evening, exactly 1 month after my conversation with Mrs. Chen, that I finally saw the stalker clearly for the first time. I had been washing dishes after dinner when I noticed a figure standing completely motionless under the streetlight directly across from my house, positioned in such a way that they had a clear view of my front windows while remaining partially concealed by the shadows of a large oak tree. Unlike the brief glimpses and peripheral sightings I had grown accustomed to, this figure was making no attempt to hide, standing in plain sight as if they wanted to be seen and acknowledged. My heart began to race as I realized that the pattern of behavior was escalating once again, moving from hidden observation to open intimidation. The figure was tall and thin, wearing dark clothing that made it difficult to distinguish specific features from my position inside the house, but their posture and stillness conveyed a sense of patient, predatory focus that made my blood run cold. They stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes, never moving, never looking away from my house, creating an atmosphere of menace that seemed to permeate the air itself. I found myself frozen at my kitchen sink, afraid to move closer to the window for a better look, but unable to step away from the sight of this person who had finally revealed themselves after weeks of hiding in shadows and peripheral vision. When I finally worked up the courage to approach my front window for a clearer view, the figure remained in position, now clearly aware that I was looking back at them, but showing no sign of being deterred by my observation. If anything, their stillness seemed to intensify, as if my attention was exactly what they had been waiting for. I could feel the weight of their gaze even though I couldn't make out their features clearly, and the realization that we were now engaged in a direct confrontation across the distance of the street filled me with a terror that was both primal and overwhelming. This was no longer passive surveillance. It was an open declaration of intent that felt like a direct threat to my safety and well-being. The psychological warfare of that evening was expertly calculated to maximize my fear and sense of helplessness. The stalker had chosen to reveal themselves on a night when the rain and poor visibility would make it difficult for neighbors to notice what was happening, and their position under the streetlight created a theatrical effect that seemed designed to burn their image into my memory. They were demonstrating their ability to stand openly in my neighborhood without fear of consequence, showing me that they felt confident enough in their anonymity and safety to escalate from hiding to open intimidation. The message was clear. They could approach as closely as they wanted, whenever they wanted, and there was nothing I could do to stop them. After what felt like an eternity, the figure finally began to move, but instead of leaving the area, they walked slowly along the sidewalk in front of my house, maintaining their focus on my windows while making a complete circuit of my property. They moved with deliberate, measured steps that suggested they were in no hurry and felt no concern about being seen or reported. As they completed their circuit and returned to their original position under the streetlight, they raised one hand in what appeared to be a casual wave before finally disappearing into the darkness between streetlights. The gesture was casual and almost friendly, but in context it felt like the most threatening communication I had ever received. I spent the rest of that night awake and vigilant, calling Mrs. Chen to report what I had seen and checking every lock and window in my house multiple times before finally attempting to get some sleep. Mrs. Chen listened to my account with the weary recognition of someone who had heard similar stories before, and she urged me to call the police immediately to create an official report of the stalking behavior. This is exactly how it started with Sarah, she told me, her voice heavy with concern. Once they start showing themselves openly, it means they're getting ready to do something more serious. You need to get help now before it's too late. Her words echoed in my mind as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to every sound outside my windows. The police responded to my call the next morning with professional courtesy, but obvious skepticism about the severity of my situation. The officer who took my report was patient and thorough, documenting the gifts, the surveillance, and the previous night's open intimidation, but I could see in his expression that he viewed this as a relatively minor incident of neighborhood harassment rather than the escalating threat that it felt like to me. He explained that without a clear identification of the perpetrator or evidence of actual criminal activity beyond trespassing, there was little the department could do beyond increasing patrols in the area and advising me to document any further incidents. His recommendation was to install security cameras and consider varying my routine to make surveillance more difficult.
The investigation that followed was thorough, but ultimately fruitless, hampered by the stalkers' careful avoidance of security cameras and witnesses throughout their campaign of harassment. The police interviewed neighbors, examined the gifts for fingerprints, and reviewed what little security camera footage was available from nearby businesses, but found no useful evidence that could lead to identification or arrest. The stalker had been remarkably careful to avoid leaving any traceable evidence, suggesting a level of planning and criminal sophistication that made them far more dangerous than a typical neighborhood nuisance. Even more frustrating was the discovery that the previous incidents with other tenants had never been officially reported, making it impossible to establish the pattern of behavior that might have helped build a stronger case. The officer's final assessment was that I was likely dealing with someone who had developed an obsession with my house or with women who lived alone, and that the best course of action was to make the property as unappealing as possible through increased security measures and unpredictable routines. He suggested installing motion sensor lights, security cameras, and an alarm system, while also recommending that I consider staying elsewhere until the situation resolved itself. His casual suggestion that the problem might simply resolve itself felt inadequate given the escalating nature of the behavior, but I understood that the police were limited in their ability to act without more concrete evidence of criminal intent. The meeting left me feeling more vulnerable than ever, with the official confirmation that I was essentially on my own against whoever was targeting me. For several weeks after my meeting with the police, the stalking behavior seemed to diminish significantly, creating a false sense of security that I desperately wanted to believe was permanent. The nightly surveillance stopped, no new gifts appeared on my property, and the feeling of being constantly watched gradually began to fade as I settled back into something resembling a normal routine. I began to hope that the police visit, even if it hadn't resulted in an arrest, had been enough to scare off whoever had been harassing me. I installed the recommended security measures and started to feel like I might be able to reclaim my sense of safety and enjoy my home the way I had during those first innocent days after moving in. But my relief was premature, and the calm period turned out to be merely a strategic pause rather than an end to the harassment. Mrs. Chen warned me not to let my guard down, reminding me that Sarah had experienced similar quiet periods that had lulled her into false security before the stalking resumed with increased intensity. "They're just waiting," she told me during one of our regular check-in conversations, "waiting for you to relax, waiting for the police to move on to other things, waiting for the right moment to start again." Her words proved to be prophetic when, exactly 6 weeks after my police report, I discovered that my house key no longer worked in my front door lock. The realization that someone had been inside my house while I was at work filled me with terror that was unlike anything I had experienced during the previous months of external surveillance and harassment. I stood on my own front porch, trying my key repeatedly in a lock that had been changed without my knowledge or permission, while the implications of what this meant sank in with horrifying clarity. Someone had not only been watching my house, but had gained access to it, spending time inside my personal space and among my belongings while I was away. They had replaced the lock with one that looked identical to the original, suggesting a level of preparation and skill that went far beyond amateur harassment into something much more sophisticated and dangerous. When I finally gained entry to my house with the help of a locksmith, I discovered that the intrusion had been far more extensive than just changing the locks. My belongings had been carefully rearranged throughout the house in ways that were subtle enough to avoid immediate detection, but obvious enough to communicate that someone had been there. Books were placed in different orders on my shelves, photographs were turned at slight angles, and items of clothing had been moved between drawers in ways that suggested someone had spent considerable time exploring my personal possessions. Most disturbing of all, I found several photographs of myself sleeping that had been taken from inside my bedroom, apparently over multiple nights, and left arranged on my kitchen table where I couldn't possibly miss them. The violation of my personal space was so complete and intimate that it felt like a form of psychological rape, designed to destroy any remaining sense of security or privacy I might have maintained despite the previous harassment. Whoever had done this had not only gained physical access to my home, but had used that access to demonstrate their ability to observe and document my most vulnerable moments without my knowledge. The message was clear. There was nowhere I could go, nothing I could do, no precaution I could take that would keep them from reaching me whenever they chose to do so. The house that I had hoped would become my sanctuary had been irreversibly contaminated by their presence.
The photographs themselves were the most terrifying evidence of how long this violation had been going on, and how completely I had been at the mercy of someone who apparently felt no boundaries or limits to their obsession. The images showed me sleeping in different positions and wearing different nightgowns over what appeared to be at least a dozen separate nights, suggesting that the stalker had been entering my house regularly for weeks without my knowledge. Some of the photographs captured me in states of partial undress, and all of them had been taken from angles that required the photographer to be standing very close to my bed, close enough that they could have touched me or harmed me at any point during those vulnerable hours when I was unconscious and defenseless. I called the police immediately, and this time their response was far more serious and urgent given the clear evidence of breaking and entering, invasion of privacy, and what appeared to be preparation for more serious crimes. Detective Morrison, who took over my case, explained that the behavior pattern I was describing matched that of predatory stalkers who often escalate to physical assault or abduction once they have established the level of access and control that my stalker had achieved. The crime scene team spent several hours in my house, photographing everything and collecting evidence, though they warned me that the perpetrator had been remarkably careful about avoiding fingerprints and other traceable evidence throughout their campaign of harassment and violation. The detective's assessment was that I was in immediate danger and should not remain in the house alone until the stalker was apprehended. But I had nowhere else to go on such short notice and limited financial resources to sustain a long-term relocation. Mrs. Chen offered to let me stay with her temporarily, but I was afraid that my presence might put her at risk as well, given the escalating and unpredictable nature of the stalker's behavior. We compromised on a plan where I would stay in my house, but with increased police patrols and a direct line to emergency response while the investigation continued and hopefully led to an arrest before the stalker decided to escalate their behavior even further. That night was the longest of my life, spent listening to every sound and watching every shadow while trying to maintain the appearance of normal routine in case the stalker was still conducting surveillance from outside the house. I had changed all the locks again and installed additional security measures, but I knew that someone who had demonstrated the ability to gain entry once could probably do so again if they were determined enough. Every creak in the house made me wonder if I was hearing normal settling sounds or the footsteps of an intruder who had found another way inside. Every shadow that moved outside my windows could have been a tree branch in the wind or the figure of someone preparing to make their next move against me. Around 3 in the morning, I was startled awake by the sound of my back door opening, despite the new locks and additional security measures I had installed just hours before. I lay in bed paralyzed with terror, listening to the unmistakable sounds of footsteps moving through my house with the confident familiarity of someone who had been there many times before. The intruder made no attempt at stealth, walking normally through my living room and kitchen as if they belonged there, occasionally pausing in ways that suggested they were examining or rearranging items, just as they had done during their previous violation of my space. I reached for my phone to call 911, but discovered that the line had been cut, leaving me completely isolated and helpless against whatever this person planned to do next. The footsteps eventually made their way down the hallway toward my bedroom, each step bringing my stalker closer to a direct confrontation that I was completely unprepared to handle. I could hear them pause outside my bedroom door, and I knew with absolute certainty that they were aware I was awake and listening to their approach. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, a psychological torture that was almost worse than whatever physical threat might follow. When the doorknob finally began to turn, I found my voice and screamed as loudly as I could, hoping to alert the neighbors and perhaps frighten away the intruder, but also knowing that I was likely beyond the reach of any help that might come. But instead of entering my room, the footsteps retreated quickly toward the back of the house, apparently startled by my scream and concerned about attracting attention from neighbors or police. I heard the back door slam shut, and then silence returned to the house, leaving me alone with the racing of my own heartbeat and the knowledge that I had just survived a direct confrontation with someone who apparently had no boundaries or limits to their obsession with me. I remained in bed until dawn, too terrified to leave my room and investigate what the intruder might have done during their time in my house, and too frightened to fall back asleep in case they decided to return before morning came.
When the police arrived in response to Mrs. Chen's call, she had heard my scream and called for help immediately. They found evidence that the intruder had indeed been inside my house, but once again had been careful to avoid leaving any traceable fingerprints or DNA evidence. Detective Morrison explained that my stalker was demonstrating behavior consistent with someone who was building up to an abduction or assault, using the psychological warfare of repeated violations to weaken my resistance and establish their dominance over my environment and sense of security. His recommendation was immediate relocation to a secure location until the perpetrator could be identified and apprehended, as my safety could no longer be guaranteed despite police patrols and security measures. The detective also revealed information about my house that cast the entire situation in a new and even more disturbing light. According to records his investigation had uncovered, 696 Maple Street had been the site of 3 similar cases over the past 5 years, all involving young women who had lived alone, and all following the same escalating pattern of surveillance, gifts, harassment, and eventual disappearance. The house seemed to attract these situations in ways that couldn't be explained by simple coincidence, almost as if the property itself was somehow drawing predators and victims together in an endless cycle of violence and terror. Most disturbing of all was the revelation that none of the previous cases had ever been solved, and the women who had disappeared had never been found or heard from again. Mrs. Chen's warnings about the house taking people before suddenly made horrifying sense as I realized that I was just the latest in a series of victims who had been selected not randomly, but because of their connection to this specific property. The house at 696 Maple Street wasn't just the site of stalking incidents, it was apparently some kind of focal point that attracted predators and facilitated their crimes in ways that allowed them to operate with complete impunity. Whether this was due to the house's location, layout, or some other factor, it had become a trap that lured unsuspecting women into situations where they became prey for someone who seemed to know exactly how to exploit the property's vulnerabilities and their own isolation. The investigation revealed that each previous victim had followed almost exactly the same pattern I had experienced. Initial period of safety and normalcy, gradual escalation of surveillance and harassment, gifts and evidence of intimate knowledge about their routines, direct confrontation and home invasion, and finally, disappearance without trace or explanation. The similarities were so precise that they suggested either the same perpetrator was responsible for all incidents or that multiple predators were somehow using the house as a hunting ground where they could perfect their techniques on a steady stream of vulnerable victims. Either possibility was equally terrifying and made it clear that my situation was far more dangerous than even I had realized. Detective Morrison arranged for me to be relocated to a safe house while the investigation continued. But as I packed my essential belongings, I couldn't shake the feeling that leaving the house wouldn't necessarily end my ordeal.
The pattern established by previous victims suggested that the threat was somehow connected to the property itself, rather than just being a random crime. And I worried that distance might not provide the protection I needed. Mrs. Chen helped me load my car while sharing more details about the previous tenants that she had withheld during our earlier conversations, apparently hoping that I would be able to break the cycle where they had failed. Her final words as I drove away were a warning that still haunts me. The house will call you back. It always does. And when you come back, you'll disappear just like the others. 6 months later, I'm writing this account from a small apartment across town, trying to rebuild my life while constantly looking over my shoulder for signs that my stalker has found me again. The official investigation into the incidents at 696 Maple Street was eventually closed due to lack of evidence and leads, though Detective Morrison privately told me that he believes the house is somehow central to a pattern of predatory behavior that has been going on for much longer than the documented cases suggest. The property has remained empty since my departure, with several potential tenants backing out of lease agreements after meeting with Mrs. Chen or learning about the history of disappearances connected to the address. The landlord has reportedly considered demolishing the structure, but legal complications related to the ongoing missing persons cases have prevented any major changes to the property.
Despite my physical distance from 696 Maple Street, I continue to experience incidents that suggest my ordeal is far from over and may never truly end. Strange gifts still appear outside my new apartment, always placed with the same careful timing and positioning that characterized the harassment at my previous address. My new neighbors have reported seeing unfamiliar figures lurking around the building at night, and I've received anonymous messages suggesting that my stalker knows my current location and is simply waiting for the right moment to resume their campaign of terror. The sense of being constantly watched has never fully disappeared, and I've come to accept that changing my address was only a temporary reprieve rather than a permanent solution to the nightmare that began at the house on Maple Street. Mrs. Chen calls me regularly to provide updates about the property and to check on my well-being, though her reports are consistently disturbing and suggest that the house continues to exert some kind of malevolent influence even while empty. She describes seeing lights moving inside the abandoned structure at night, despite the electricity having been disconnected months ago, and hearing sounds of footsteps and voices coming from within the building when no one should be there. More troubling are her reports of new people showing interest in renting the property, always young women living alone, always drawn to the house despite its reputation and the warnings of neighbors who try to steer them away. She has made it her mission to intercept these potential victims and share the truth about what happened to previous tenants, but she fears that eventually someone will ignore her warnings and the cycle will begin again. The most disturbing aspect of my ongoing situation is the growing realization that the house at 696 Maple Street may not simply be the location where predators choose to hunt, but rather an active participant in creating the conditions that allow these crimes to occur. My research into the property's history has revealed a pattern of disappearances and unexplained incidents that stretches back decades, long before the recent documented cases that brought the situation to police attention. Former residents from the 1970s and 1980s reported similar experiences of surveillance, harassment, and home invasion, though many of these incidents were never officially reported due to the social attitudes of the time and the lack of credible police response to crimes against women. The house seems to create its own victims, drawing vulnerable people into its sphere of influence and then facilitating their destruction through means that remain mysterious and terrifying. As I write this final entry, I can see 696 Maple Street from my current apartment window when I stand in just the right position and look through the gap between two office buildings several blocks away.
The house sits empty and dark most of the time, but occasionally I catch glimpses of movement in the windows or see lights that shouldn't be there flickering behind the curtains that Mrs. Chen closed before the property was abandoned. Sometimes I feel an almost irresistible urge to return to the house, to walk through those rooms one more time, and confront whatever force has made that place a focal point for so much suffering and terror. Mrs. Chen warned me about this compulsion, explaining that Sarah had expressed similar desires in her final weeks before disappearing, and that the house seems to call its victims back when they try to escape its influence. I fight against this urge daily, knowing that returning would likely mean joining the ranks of women who entered that property and were never seen again. But the pull grows stronger with each passing week, and I'm not sure how much longer I can resist the house's call to come home.
It was Tuesday evening, and I was settling into my usual routine of checking emails while dinner cooked in the kitchen. I live alone in a modest two-bedroom apartment on the 6th floor of Maple Gardens complex, and my days had become comfortably predictable over the past 3 years. The building was one of those older constructions from the 1980s, with thick walls and reliable plumbing that made it feel solid and permanent. I had chosen this place specifically because it felt safe, tucked away from the main road, but close enough to everything I needed for my daily life. My apartment had always been my sanctuary. The living room faced east, with large windows that let in morning light, casting long golden rectangles across my hardwood floors each dawn. The bedroom overlooked the courtyard where children played during weekends, their laughter echoing off the brick walls in a comforting rhythm. The kitchen connected to a small balcony where I kept my herbs, basil, rosemary, and mint that I used for cooking and tea. I knew every creak of the floorboards, every shadow cast by the streetlights, every reflection in my windows at different times of day. This was my territory where I felt completely safe and protected from whatever chaos existed in the outside world. Back then, my days followed the same reassuring pattern that had developed naturally over months of living alone. I would wake at 7 to the gentle buzz of my alarm, make coffee while checking the morning news on my tablet, then settle into my home office to work until 5. After work, I would cook dinner while listening to podcasts, usually true crime stories that felt safely removed from my own quiet existence. It was a simple life, but comfortable in its predictability. I never imagined that this very predictability could be weaponized against me, turned into a tool for someone else's twisted entertainment. I remember feeling particularly content that Tuesday evening as autumn settled over the city. The aroma of garlic and herbs filled the kitchen while I prepared my favorite pasta dish, my phone propped against the backsplash, playing the latest episode of a murder mystery podcast. The warm glow from my table lamps created that perfect cozy atmosphere I'd worked so hard to cultivate since moving in. Outside my kitchen window, the courtyard was peaceful, with only a few lights glowing in the apartments across the way, each one representing another person settling into their own evening routine. If I had known that would be my last evening of genuine peace in that apartment, I would have savored it more intentionally. I would have paid closer attention to those mundane details that would soon become precious memories of when my home still felt like home. The way my wooden spoon clinked against the ceramic pot, the familiar weight of my grandmother's rose quartz necklace against my chest, the soft hum of my refrigerator, all sounds that would soon be overshadowed by paranoia. I would have lingered longer at my windows, appreciating the view without the constant fear of being observed in return. I was stirring pasta sauce and scrolling through social media when everything began to change. Such an ordinary activity
that I still do today, but it will never feel the same again. My phone sat beside the stove, occasionally buzzing with notifications that I would glance at between stirring and seasoning. The kitchen was warm and filled with the comforting sounds of dinner preparation, the kind of domestic tranquility that I had always associated with safety and normalcy. I had always believed my building was secure enough for a single woman living alone. We had key fob entry that required residents to buzz visitors up, security cameras in the lobby that recorded everyone coming and going, and Mrs. Chen from 603 who kept a friendly but watchful eye over our hallway. The building had a good reputation in the neighborhood, with long-term residents who looked out for each other. I had never experienced any problems with break-ins, theft, or external threats of any kind during my 3 years of residence. It was during this absolutely routine evening that I noticed the first sign something was different. So subtle that I almost dismissed it entirely. The kind of thing that registers as slightly odd but not worth interrupting your dinner preparation. My phone had buzzed with what I assumed was another social media notification, but when I glanced down, I saw something that made me pause mid-stir. The notification wasn't from any app I recognized, and the preview text was unlike anything I'd seen before.
My immediate reaction was completely logical and dismissive. It must be a wrong number, or some kind of new spam technique designed to seem personal and get my attention. I deleted the message without responding and continued stirring my sauce, mentally filing it away as just another annoyance of modern digital life. The pasta was almost ready, and I was more focused on not overcooking it than worrying about a random text from a stranger. I even chuckled slightly at the absurdity of someone telling me I looked peaceful when I was standing alone in my kitchen. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed again with another message from a different unknown number. This one read, "The red sweater suits you." And this time I paid much more attention to the words. I looked down at myself and felt a chill run through my body. I was indeed wearing my red cardigan, the one I had thrown on when the evening air started getting cool. The coincidence seemed too specific to be random, but I tried to maintain my logical thinking. Maybe it was still spam. Maybe someone was just guessing common clothing items. Throughout that evening, small incidents began to accumulate in a way that transformed my cozy night into something far more sinister. 3 more messages arrived from different numbers, each commenting on something immediate and specific about my appearance, my activities, or my apartment. One mentioned the pasta I was cooking, another noted that I had turned on my living room lamp, and the third commented on the podcast I was listening to. Individually, each message could potentially be explained away as coincidence or lucky guessing. Together, they began forming a disturbing pattern that suggested someone was watching me in real time. Eventually, I walked to my living room window to look outside, my heart beating faster than it should have been. The courtyard below was empty, except for the usual parked cars and the soft glow emanating from other apartments' windows. A few people moved about in their own lit windows across the way, but nothing seemed out of place or threatening. The scene looked exactly as it always did in the evening: peaceful, residential, safe. I returned to the kitchen feeling somewhat reassured, telling myself I was overreacting to what was probably just an elaborate prank or series of coincidences. Even so, an unsettling sensation lingered long after I had finished eating and cleaned up the kitchen. That feeling of being watched persisted even though I knew I was alone in my apartment, even though I had checked the locks and drawn some of my curtains. It was the kind of awareness that makes your skin crawl, like when you sense someone staring at you in a crowded room. I tried to shake it off by focusing on other activities, but the feeling clung to me like smoke. Every time I passed by a window, I felt exposed, vulnerable in a way I had never experienced in my own home.
To distract myself from these uncomfortable thoughts, I turned up the volume on my podcast and focused intently on cleaning the kitchen and preparing for the next day. The familiar routine of washing dishes and wiping counters usually calmed my mind, and I hoped it would work its usual magic tonight. It did work temporarily. Our minds are remarkably good at deflecting minor discomforts when we give them something concrete to focus on. But even as I went through these motions, part of my attention remained hyper-aware of my surroundings, listening for sounds that shouldn't be there. But the messages didn't stop that night, and they continued throughout the rest of the week with increasing frequency and specificity. Comments arrived about my morning coffee routine, noting that I preferred 2 sugars and always used the blue ceramic mug. Messages described my evening yoga sessions in my living room, mentioning specific poses I had done and how long I held them. Other texts commented on the books I carried to and from the mailbox, sometimes quoting passages I had been reading. It became impossible to continue ignoring that someone was actively and extensively monitoring every detail of my daily life. That's when I finally saw him. A figure standing perfectly still at the window of apartment 601, directly across the courtyard from my building. Even from 6 floors up and across the expanse of the courtyard, I could tell he was looking directly at my apartment, his posture unnaturally rigid and focused. He stood so motionlessly that at first I thought he might be a cardboard cutout or some kind of decoration. But then I noticed the subtle way shadows played across what had to be a human form. There was no more room for rationalization or denial. Someone was systematically watching me, studying me, learning my patterns with scientific precision. My blood ran cold as the reality of my situation crashed over me like a wave of ice water. For several seconds, I stood frozen at my own window, processing what I was seeing and what it meant for my safety. My heart hammered against my ribs with such force that I could hear the pulse in my ears, and my breathing became shallow and rapid as panic began to set in. The comfortable distance I had maintained between myself and the true crime stories I listened to suddenly collapsed. I was no longer a passive observer of someone else's nightmare. This was happening to me, in my safe space, in my carefully constructed sanctuary.
I stepped carefully closer to my window to get a better look at the figure, trying to make out features or details that might help me identify who was watching me. The man remained motionless at his window, but the moment I moved closer to get a clearer view, he stepped backward into the shadows of his apartment and disappeared from sight. His presence had vanished as suddenly as I had noticed it, but it left behind the absolute certainty that this wasn't my imagination or paranoia. Someone was there, someone was watching, and they were aware enough of my movements to hide when I tried to observe them in return. I immediately secured every possible entry point to my apartment, locking my balcony door and checking the deadbolt on my front door twice. I drew all my curtains closed and turned on every light in my apartment, transforming my usually cozy space into something that felt more like a bunker than a home. My apartment, which had always been a refuge from the outside world, suddenly felt exposed and vulnerable from every angle. The walls that had once made me feel protected now seemed thin and inadequate, barely a barrier between me and whoever was studying my life with such disturbing intensity. I spent the next hour moving systematically from room to room, monitoring every window and checking for any movement in the courtyard or the building across from mine. Every shadow seemed potentially significant. Every light that turned on or off in the neighboring buildings made me wonder if it was connected to my watcher. The sensation of being hunted was unmistakable and terrifying, like being the prey animal that finally realizes a predator has been tracking it. I had become hyper-aware of every sound, every movement, every change in the environment around my apartment. Then, it happened again. more obviously this time, as if my watcher wanted me to know I was being observed. I caught sight of him standing on his balcony in broad daylight, completely motionless and facing my apartment with unwavering focus. Even with my curtains drawn, I knew he was staring directly at my windows, probably trying to detect any movement or signs of my presence inside. The boldness of his surveillance during daylight hours suggested a confidence that was deeply unsettling. He wasn't trying to hide anymore. He wanted me to know he was there, wanted me to feel watched and vulnerable. There was no doubt remaining in my mind. Someone was deliberately and systematically targeting me for surveillance. This wasn't random, wasn't coincidental, and wasn't some misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a conversation. This was focused, intentional, and personal in a way that suggested either mental illness or malicious intent. Neither possibility offered any comfort. The methodical nature of the observation, combined with the increasingly personal text messages, painted a picture of someone who was obsessed with learning every detail of my private life. I grabbed a kitchen knife from my knife block and positioned myself at my dining table, where I could see multiple windows simultaneously and monitor different angles of approach to my apartment. The sense of security in my own home had been completely destroyed in the span of a few days, replaced by a constant state of alertness that was already exhausting me. I realized that I was now living like a prisoner in my own space, afraid to move freely or engage in normal activities because I knew I was being watched and analyzed. The harassment began escalating beyond just observation and text messages into something more tangible and threatening. I started finding small objects placed carefully in front of my apartment door. Tiny clay sculptures, each one meticulously crafted and wearing a miniature version of the rose quartz necklace that my grandmother had given me before she died. The sculptures were crude, but detailed enough that there was no mistaking what they were meant to represent. Someone had been close enough to study my jewelry, to notice the specific way the rose quartz pendant hung from its silver chain, and to recreate it in clay with disturbing accuracy. When I discovered the first sculpture, I knew my last barrier of safety had been completely breached. Someone had been inside my building, had walked down my hallway, had stood directly outside my door long enough to carefully place this object where I would find it. The building security measures that I had relied on, the key fob entry, the cameras, the watchful neighbors, had all failed to protect me from this intrusion. Whoever was doing this had found a way to get uncomfortably close to my most private space without being detected or stopped. At that moment, terror became my primary and overwhelming emotion, drowning out rational thought and replacing it with pure survival instinct. My hands shook uncontrollably as I examined the small clay figure, noting how accurately it replicated not just my necklace, but also small details like the tiny chip in the rose quartz that had happened years ago. I was completely exposed in what should have been my most secure space, vulnerable to someone who had been studying me with the intensity of a scientist studying a specimen. The level of detail in the sculpture suggested hours of observation, careful note-taking, and deliberate preparation. I shouted toward the hallway that I knew someone was there, that I was calling the police, hoping my voice would carry far enough to discourage whoever was tormenting me. I made as much noise as possible, slamming doors and turning lights on and off, trying to signal that I was alert and fighting back against this invasion of my privacy. I wanted to demonstrate that I wasn't a passive victim, that I was aware of what was happening and prepared to take action to protect myself. But even as I made these defensive gestures, I knew they were largely symbolic. If someone could get close enough to leave sculptures at my door, they could probably do much worse. But the harassment didn't stop or even slow down in response to my resistance.
More sculptures appeared every few days, each one placed with the same careful precision as the first, and the text messages continued coming from an endless supply of different phone numbers. My attempts at resistance seemed to only intensify my stalker's determination, as if my fear and anger were feeding their obsession rather than discouraging it. The sculptures became more detailed, incorporating elements from my daily routine that showed the depth of surveillance I was under. That's when I noticed my Wi-Fi network list had changed in a way that made my blood freeze in my veins. Among the usual apartment networks with names like Johnson Wi-Fi and apt_3b_internet appeared a new one that made the threat explicitly clear. 601 is watching. Physical, technological proof that this harassment was real, that my paranoia was completely justified, and that whoever was doing this wanted me to know exactly where they were located. The network name was a direct message to me, a way of claiming responsibility and letting me know that my digital environment was as compromised as my physical one. I finally called the police and reported everything I had experienced: the messages, the sculptures, the figure at the window, the threatening Wi-Fi network name, and the escalating pattern of surveillance. The dispatcher took my report seriously and promised to send officers to take a statement and investigate the situation. The officer who arrived was polite, but I could tell he was skeptical about what concrete action he could take with what amounted to mostly circumstantial evidence. He photographed the sculptures and took notes about the text messages, but explained that proving harassment would require more direct evidence of threats or criminal activity. In the minutes before the police arrived to take my statement, I experienced the most intense vulnerability of my entire life. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. Every sound in the hallway might signal an escalation I wasn't prepared to handle alone. I sat at my kitchen table with the knife beside me, watching the door and listening for any sign that my tormentor might be getting bolder. The wait felt endless, though it was probably only 15 minutes, and I realized how truly isolated I had become, cut off from the normal rhythms of life by someone else's obsession with controlling and frightening me. When the officers finally arrived, they took my report thoroughly and documented the sculptures as evidence. They listened to my description of the text messages and the figure in the window, taking notes and asking clarifying questions about timing and frequency. They said they would speak with the resident of apartment 601 and investigate whether the Wi-Fi network name constituted a form of harassment. However, they also explained that observation from someone's own apartment window wasn't technically illegal, and that proving intentional stalking would require more concrete evidence of criminal intent or direct threats to my safety. The police investigation found no definitive evidence of actual trespassing or explicit threats that would justify an arrest. The man in apartment 601 claimed complete ignorance about the sculptures, insisting he had never seen them before and suggesting they might be the work of neighborhood kids playing pranks. By the time the officers checked for the threatening Wi-Fi network, it had mysteriously changed back to something generic and innocuous, making it impossible to document. Without physical evidence or witness testimony, there was little the police could do beyond filing a report and advising me to document any future incidents.
For a few days afterward, I felt safer and more optimistic about my situation. The messages stopped completely. No new sculptures appeared at my door, and I began to believe that the police visit had scared off my tormentor for good. I started to resume some of my normal routines, thinking that maybe the officer had been right about it being someone who would lose interest once confronted with the possibility of legal consequences. I was so wrong about how deeply this person's obsession ran, and how temporary this reprieve would turn out to be. Several weeks later,
I realized I would never feel completely secure in that apartment again, regardless of how long the harassment remained dormant. I found myself checking locks obsessively, multiple times before bed, avoiding windows even during daylight hours, and jumping at every unexpected sound in the hallway or courtyard. Every delivery person, every footstep in the hallway, every door that opened or closed in my building made me freeze with anxiety and listen carefully to determine if it posed a threat. My home had been transformed from a sanctuary into a space where I felt constantly under siege. Small incidents continued to occur sporadically, just often enough to prevent me from relaxing completely or forgetting about the threat. My Wi-Fi network list would occasionally show that menacing 601 is watching network name for a few hours before disappearing again, as if to remind me that my digital privacy was still compromised. I would catch glimpses of movement at the 601 window when I dared to peek through my curtains, though never long enough to be certain of what I was seeing. Sometimes my phone would receive a single message with no words, just a photo taken from the courtyard showing my apartment building or my specific windows, proof that the surveillance was ongoing, even when I couldn't detect it. I installed additional deadbolts, covered my windows with blackout curtains that blocked any view in or out, and started varying my daily routine randomly to make surveillance more difficult. I changed my phone number and deleted all my social media accounts, hoping to cut off the channels my stalker was using to gather information about me. But none of these defensive measures eliminated the persistent feeling of vulnerability that had settled into my bones like a chronic illness. The knowledge that someone could monitor me so thoroughly and invisibly had fundamentally changed how I experienced my own home and my own life. Today, 6 months later, I still check my doorway for sculptures every morning before leaving for work, and I scan the network list on my devices regularly to see if my tormentor is still digitally present. I've never found another sculpture, but I know that doesn't mean the threat has ended. It might just mean they've gotten better at watching without being detected. Because, deep down, I know that the person in apartment 601 is still there, still watching, still collecting information about my life with the patience of someone who views this as a long-term project rather than a temporary fascination. And next time they decide to make contact, they might not be content to remain at a distance.